Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 60, and boy do we have a few bits of channel admin for you today. So first off, the schedule for America. Quite a lot of wonderful people over in America have pointed out that America is a very big place, perhaps bigger than I'd given it credit for, and I probably need to revise the schedule somewhat in terms of travel time, etc. So I will be doing that, and hopefully by next Drydock I'll have a revised schedule up for everyone to comment on and tell me what part I missed this time. The wonderful thing about travelling in a country that's bigger than the entire continent you're actually based on. Never mind. Additionally, a few of you will have noticed the double 5-minute guide for the Colossus, Majestic class and the Magnificent, and there's a few more coming up this month. Don't get too used to that. That does take a fair bit of work, but this is purely predicated on the principle that I realised I'm reviewing ships, specific ships, and I hadn't actually reviewed the class before, and my standing policy is not to review a specific ship in a class until I've done the class in general. So that's why this month, apart from the Bonaventure, every other Saturday has a double 5-minute guide upload, but don't get too used to it, basically is what I'm saying. Additionally, sponsorship. So a lot of you will have noticed that the Battle of Tsushima video was sponsored. I just want to clarify and clear up a few things with regard to that, because that was a fairly frequently asked question in that video, and I can only type the same thing so many times. So with regards to sponsorships, in this particular case with the Great Courses Plus, I did take that sponsorship. I took that sponsorship after careful consideration, primarily on the basis of my conclusion that the potential sponsor actually offered something that the audience, who presumably are interested in naval history, would actually find worthwhile. This is not the start of ads appearing in every single video and taking mass numbers of sponsorships. I could do that. If you had a look at my email inbox with the various sponsorship offers, etc., that have come in over the past few months, there's a fair number of them, but ultimately, as I've said to everyone before, I'm more interested in you, the audience, than I am in corporate money. So with this, as I say, with this particular one, they had sections on naval history. I had a look over them. They seemed quite interesting, and so I thought you might want to have a look at those. But this kind of sponsorship deal will be a very rare thing, I imagine, because I'm pretty sure, as much as I do, you also probably get annoyed with every second video you watch having a sponsorship with some random mobile game that's long on marketing budget and short on actual game design or some other equally absurd thing. So I'm not taking those. No way am I ever taking those, so don't worry about that too much. The winners for the 75,000 subscriber giveaway, those will be announced in the Drydock next week, so keep an ear out for that if you happen to have put yourself down for that. Then we have the matter of the Amsterdam dockyard visit. Now I'm going to be covering, well, at the time of recording, I'm going to be covering that in a live stream later today. By the time that this Drydock is released, that live stream will have already gone out, so I'll be going over that in a lot more detail there. But just to point out that for those of you who were there may have noticed me being taken around on a tour of the dockyard. As I stated in the Drydock previous to me going, I paid for all my flights. I was not in any way paid to go there, and the primary intention was to go there, get footage for the channel, and to meet a bunch of you guys, which I did successfully manage to do. However, in between me recording the last Drydock before I left for Amsterdam and actually leaving, I was put in contact with Wargaming, who wanted to offer me some bits and pieces for being there. So effectively, what did I get out of it? Full disclosure time. I got the same goodie bag that everybody else got, except that I didn't have to wait in a queue for it. And they sorted me out with a guide for the base. A very, very wonderful gentleman who has a long history, a long career in the Dutch Navy, and now helps out at the museum, and basically he took me around the various ships that were there and the museum. We got into a few bits and pieces that aren't open to the general public, and that is the sum total of the net benefit that I got from that. So that's why I was on that tour. I was not paid, and I had no intention of taking any payment for it. So the overall net benefit for that is, well, a bunch of extra I was going to say footage, but it's not footage because my camera died. Bunch of extra photos for future guides on the Abraham Christiansen, i.e. the I'm Genuinely an Island ship, and a rather interesting ironclad ram, the Scorpion, plus obviously general museum trip stuff. So I think that covers everything except for one last thing, and that is again, going back to the Battle of Tsushima, quite a number of people wanted to know where the footage of the Battle of Tsushima came from. Now, for obvious reasons, this battle was not actually filmed. That is all CGI. So the footage for that particular set of sequences came from the following series. And the series is called, well, in English at least, it's called Clouds Over the Hill. In Japanese, I think it's called Saka no Ue no Kumo. I know there's a few people who speak Japanese and will probably eviscerate me over that pronunciation, but never mind. That's what it's called. It was a 3-season Japanese TV drama. I have no idea really what most of it is about, because the only English subtitled version apparently is absolutely terrible. Has absolutely terrible English subtitles, but it's sort of naval based, and apparently in season 3 they cover the Battle of Tsushima, hence the footage. So yeah, that's where that came from. You can stop asking now. Oh, and one other thing, a lot of people have mentioned that they like the idea of the live streams, the 2 live streams that I've been doing, where I answer a bunch of questions sort of freeform style and take questions from the chat. But they did point out I do tend to get a bit distracted and it all gets a bit disjointed while I'm actually trying to play stuff at the same time. Now, that's a fair enough comment. I fully appreciate that. So in the future, what I will do is I'll run pre-recorded game content that games I've already played, or something like else similar to that. Run that stuff in the background. Maybe I'll just put up a slideshow of random warship pictures from videos past, and talk to people that way. So how that relates to everybody else, apart from just being a general announcement, is that also if you happen to have a particularly impressive World of Warships replay, or War Thunder Boats replay, or some other form of naval related game content, video replay type file that you would like to just contribute, then feel free to pop it into 5minuteguides@gmail.com. That's 5 as in FIVE, minuteguides@gmail.com, and with any luck I will stick it in the queue to be featured in a live stream. Which hopefully will allow me to concentrate a lot more on actually answering questions, instead of making snide remarks and drumming noises as I try and ram a Littorio with a Richelieu. Anyway, that's quite enough of that. I'm going to have to add a bit of extra time onto this Drydock to make up for the fact that I've been waffling on at you about the channel in general rather than answering your questions for near enough the past 10 minutes. So let's get on to the questions themselves. And today's questions are taken from the Mogami video and the Anti-Submarine Warfare in World War I video. So, Anti-Submarine Warfare in World War I video, sources for that, so freaking many. If, as I said in other videos, if you want to know the full list or a specific source, just message me, because I'm not going to list half a dozen major books and several dozen smaller ones all here at the same time. The Mogami video, however, that's slightly easier. The main source used for that video was Japanese Cruisers of the Pacific War, as shown above at the moment. I was very helpfully pointed in the direction of that particular resource by Justin Pike, who helped greatly with that particular video, as is credited in the description of that video. Yeah, the Mogami class, there's enough in that book that I could do a 2-hour video on the Mogami class and not repeat myself. That book is huge. It's 880 pages just on the Japanese cruisers of the Second World War. There's literally everything you could possibly want to know about them and more in there. It's a little bit rambly and somewhat disjointed, but if you've got the time and the effort to go through it all, I can't really recommend anything better for the particular field of study. Corporal Tommy asks, besides the Imperial Japanese Navy, Italian Navy and Kriegsmarine, did any other navies plan to upgun their warships? Generally, not to any particularly serious degree, but as the picture above might give away, there was one example of actual upgunning that actually worked pretty well, at least as far as firepower went, and that was the North Carolina class. As I've mentioned in a few other videos before, the North Carolinas and the King George V's were designed on opposite sides of the Atlantic to be compliant with the Second London Naval Treaty, and both of them originally featured 3 quadruple 14-inch gun turrets. Now, whilst King George V, being started fractionally earlier, couldn't take advantage of the escalator clause being invoked and ended up losing one of the quads in favour of a twin, the North Carolinas, being about 3 to 6 months later than the King George V, could actually take advantage of this upgunning clause. So they were hastily redesigned to take 3 triple 16-inch guns instead of 4 14-inch guns per turrets, and that's how you got the North Carolina class as they came out of the docks. So, yeah, that's an actual upgunning plan that succeeded, albeit they didn't actually ever see service with their original planned armament. Generally speaking, the nations that would later become the Western Allies tended to focus more on increasing the lethality of their existing weapons. So it would lead to things like, say, the development of the super heavy shell in the United States, which they would then try and use on the South Dakotas as well. And in the UK and the Royal Navy, they tried things like the supercharges on the 15-inch 42 caliber weapons to try and upgrade their lethality in the cases of the Revenge class and later Vanguard, and other measures such as increasing the elevation to increase range, new shell designs, etc. So that was generally what the British and the Americans would do, whereas in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the upgunning was more a case of cheating their way around the treaty limits to get more heavy cruisers because they felt they were at a disadvantage in numbers. The Italians had been left short with their battleships because they didn't have an equivalent of the Queen Elizabeths or the Colorados or the later standards, or the Nagatos for that matter, to run forward because their equivalent, the Francisco Caracoles, had never actually been completed, so they were left in a bit of a bind. And of course, Germany, with the Scharnhorsts, etc., was trying to pull themselves out of a bit of a dearth of capital ship construction in the interwar period. And so, as we said before, with the Scharnhorst class, they, at the time of building, they pretty much could make a improved 11-inch gun, and that was about it. But they knew they wanted bigger guns, so they kept the capability for it. Aaron Barbarian asks, what do you think of the Cold War modifications to World War II ships? Were they a waste of time? For example, HMS Belfast being vastly rebuilt in many ways, only to be decommissioned a few years later. Oh boy. A lot of Cold War modifications were definitely worthwhile, and that kind of falls into 2 categories. You have Cold War modifications where brand new weapons technology was being tested out. So, say something like the Baltimore class cruisers, some of them being converted to missile cruisers. I would say that, albeit that the systems themselves weren't especially successful, it was definitely worth doing because it meant that you could test live at sea various new weapons systems and technology to determine the effectiveness without having to commit to building an entire new class of ship, only potentially to find out that the centerpiece weapon system you've built the ship around was actually utterly useless. It was also a lot faster than building entirely new classes of ship, and to be perfectly honest, despite the fact that everyone immediately after the war was kind of going, oh yeah, missiles are the way of the future, the simple fact of the matter was that the Soviets still had a lot of gun cruisers around, and they were building more, and so updating existing ships was probably a much better way to go than going with a tin clad that had a bunch of brand new missile systems that, generally speaking, would actually turn out to be far less effective than the manufacturers promised in the face of ships that could potentially shrug off the one or two that actually found their targets and then come after you with multiple guns. Similarly, modifications allowed for experiments with various forms of very independent propulsion that would eventually lead to nuclear-propelled submarines, and a whole raft of new systems, actually as ironically covered by the Colossus Magnificent video, things like angled flight decks, optical landing systems, steam catapults, etc. All of these were first tested on modified World War II era hulls, and again helped with the sort of teething, troublemaking aspects of development, which then meant that the systems were not entirely but mostly mature when it came time to build the really big ships that would incorporate all this new technology, rather than, say, trying to build a Forrestal class only to discover that half the stuff you've put on, again, didn't actually work properly. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if somebody had looked at, say, the rubberized flight deck concept and aircraft with no landing gear and gone, yep, this is the way of the future, but instead of testing it on a smaller existing ship, we're just going to incorporate it into our next-gen carriers, and then you would have had the Kitty Hawk turned into the world's biggest trampoline. Now, that's not to say that there weren't a bunch of stupid decisions. There very definitely were. Particularly, I will now take the opportunity to crucify the UK for this. In a lot of ways, it actually comes back to my stated political position of I hate politicians and politics, because they're largely the ones responsible. Especially in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, and as I say, we're focusing on the UK, but to a certain degree this applies elsewhere. Not so much in the States, because Democrat or Republican, with the spectre of the Soviets looming over, everyone agreed that America should have a powerful military. In the UK, however, whether or not the UK should have a military, and if so, what weapons it should or shouldn't have, varied massively depending on which bunch of muppets they'd voted into government this particular time around. In kind of the more aerial department, you've got the famous Defence White Paper, where the previous government position of we must support British industry, we must have all this new and innovative British technology that's coming online, which, to be fair, actually was one of the few areas Britain was remaining as a world leader and fairly competitive in. And then the next government went, no, we're not going to have manned fighters, we're going to have missiles, and we're not going to have our own nuclear deterrent projection systems. We're going to buy American Skybolt missiles, and we're going to cancel everything, and the future will just be missiles, most of which aren't built here. And yeah, that didn't work very well, did it? Basically murdered the British native military aircraft industry at a stroke, and as it turned out, Skybolt was cancelled. We never did get the F-111Ks, and pretty much the only product of that entire era was the Lightning, because it was too far advanced to cancel. The Harrier, because it was a prototype, not at the actual final product, but they managed to somehow finagle getting a prototype aircraft into general service. And the F4Ks with massive Spey turbofans, which made them look rather fat. So, yes, this is the kind of disastrous political thinking and shenanigans that you get in the UK, and that's pretty much reflected in the Royal Navy, where you had ships being, as you say, refitted and then promptly scrapped or sold or retired. You had other ships soldier on for ages and ages and ages without any substantial refits. You had ships that had massive overhauls to fully modern specs, except that the project management was utterly terrible, the costs spiraled way out of control, and in the end, after having spent millions of pounds on the ships, they just got rid of them, which was, I mean, yeah, you can make a certain argument to try and prevent throwing good money after bad, but at that point some of the ships they got rid of were practically complete. And then of course you also got things like somehow concluding that 2 Town class or Crown Colony class cruisers are somehow better at fighting off Sverdlovs than the Vanguard. I still don't really see that logic, and I thoroughly disagree with it. So yes, where the Cold War modifications were done properly, they were definitely worthwhile. However, the rather how shall we try and use this politely? Moronic hand of politics ended up sabotaging an awful lot more potentially useful upgrades and modifications to World War II era ships. Andrea Marioni says, or Andrea? I don't know. Says, time and time again, you've stated you don't regard the Bismarck as a well-designed battleship due to outdated features. The question goes on a bit, listing them. But was it really such a terrible battleship when compared to its contemporaries such as the Richelieu, Littorio, King George V, North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes? Or was it capable of taking on any of these ships one-on-one and maybe defeating some of them? Now, whilst Bismarck had some questionable, outdated, in some cases actually pretty stupid design decisions that went into its construction, and whilst you could argue that the number of them is higher than in some other designs, having stupid, outdated, or otherwise inefficient design decisions that go into a capital ship's construction is not unique to Germany in this period. You can point at flaws in practically every single battleship design. I say, although Bismarck's slightly on the higher end of the bell curve in that regard, but as it's still not a terrible design. A terrible design doesn't sink HMS Hood that quickly, apart from anything else, and a terrible design doesn't end up taking so long to be battered into submission either. Now, as many of you will probably know by now, I am an engineer by trade, by profession, and this is where some of my antipathy towards the Bismarck class comes from, because the Bismarck class generally commits what is possibly one of the greatest, most cardinal sins that you can ever accuse something of when your audience is an engineer. And that is, it commits the sin of inefficiency. I could probably hear a bunch of fellow engineers who are viewing this going, back, evil one. But yes, anyway, the inefficiency of the design is the main thing that gets me. And the reason for that, effectively, is, well, as I may have mentioned elsewhere, look at its statistics, then look at its displacement. So if you look at the other ships that the question compared it to, Bismarck completes at just under 42,000 tons standard and just over 50,000 tons fully loaded. Now, compare that to the others, King George V, South Dakota, and Richelieu are all between 5,000 and 7,000 tons lighter on standard displacement, and their full load displacements are only maybe a couple of thousand tons more than Bismarck's standard displacement, and they're about 7,000 to 8,000 tons lighter than Bismarck's full displacement. So they're significantly smaller ships by displacement, and when you compare them to Bismarck, you find that the Richelieus are broadly comparable. They, compared to Bismarck, both classes have 8 15-inch guns. Both classes have just over 12 inches, just under 13 inches to be perfectly honest, of belt armour. Richelieu has better deck protection and is actually fractionally faster than Bismarck, and achieves all of this on significantly less displacement. South Dakota is significantly more heavily armed. It is a little bit slower, but its armour scheme is somewhat better, but again on much less displacement. King George V, again, is slightly slower. Gun power wise, you can make various arguments. The 14-inch guns obviously nowhere near as powerful as Bismarck's individually, but it has 10 of them as opposed to Bismarck's 8, and Prince of Wales showed that it didn't have too much of a problem inflicting damage on Bismarck. So did King George V for that matter. It's significantly better protected. in terms of armour protection all over. So you can say in that sort of very basic sort of trinity of firepower, armour and speed, those three ships are broadly comparable with Bismarck, but they're achieving that broad compatibility on effectively a small light cruiser's worth less displacement, which is a huge mark of inefficiency. Now, you look at the Littorio class. The Littorio class are close to Bismarck in displacement. The standard displacement's just under 41,000 tons. Fully loaded, they're just over 45. So they're a little bit lighter than Bismarck, but not by a tremendous amount. But what do they get in exchange for that? Well, they get an extra 15-inch gun that's just as if not more capable than Bismarck's, assuming they have some decent shells. And for all the various debates about the armour protection is broadly equivalent to Bismarck's in terms of ability to resist shells coming through the main belt. Deck protection is broadly similar. Speed is broadly similar. Obviously, range is a bit less. But the Littorios do have issues with their torpedo defence system taking up far more space than it has any right to, as well as a very fat very weird setup for their main armour belt system, which we'll go into more detail on in videos on the class in particular. But broadly speaking, assuming decent shell quality, the Littorios are actually a superior ship to the Bismarck. As I say, similar protection, similar speed, superior number of guns, and much better fire control. So, yeah, the Littorio's slightly lighter, but a superior ship. And then you get to the Iowas, and the Iowas, granted, their standard loading is significantly greater, as is their full loading. But the Iowas are faster than Bismarck, infinitely better armed, and their armour protection is a bit better as well than Bismarck. So it's a flat-out superior ship. Not that should come as a great surprise, considering that it is about 6,000 tons more than standard loading than a Bismarck is. Tirpitz closes that gap a little bit, but not too much. So yeah, basically that's it. Iowa, unsurprisingly, is superior, but it should be, given the extra displacement that it's got. But the main thing I hold against the Bismarck is effectively that, broadly speaking, it's the ships that it's roughly comparable with are ships that are several thousand tons lighter than it is. Therefore, it's an inefficient design, and as an engineer, inefficiency is a terrible thing that you should always avoid if possible, and you should always criticise when you find it. Effectively, if German ship designers had a bit more experience and or had been willing to learn a bit more from other people, they probably could have fitted a ship with just as much lethality as Bismarck into a much cheaper and smaller unit. War Daddy Industries, well, there's an interesting name, says, have you read the book Six Frigates by Ian Toll, and what do you think about it? Also, do you think if the Germans focused more on the convoys bound for Russia, that they could potentially have knocked them out of the war, seeing as they were a more immediate threat compared to Britain, since Britain lacked a large enough army to land at the time? So I think the book Six Frigates is an absolutely excellent book. I have now got my hands on a copy of it, and I've read it. The only thing that I would say that is in any way a negative to it is that, and this is, to be honest, this isn't actually a flaw of the book per se, it's a flaw of practically every bit of literature that's been written about the Six Frigates, and more specific, well, so the Six Frigates specifically, and more generally the War of 1812, and that whole period in general, which is that almost no book has a completely neutral standpoint or bias to it. So if you read Six Frigates, although as with most of the better works on the era, it does include both positive and negative experiences from the ships, it is more slanted towards the US side of things. Whereas if, say, you read something like The Challenge by Andrew Lambert, it's more slanted toward the British side of things. It's undeniable, but again, it's an excellent book, an excellent publication, and contains positives and negatives from both sides. But like Six Frigates is somewhat biased towards the American side, The Challenge is slightly biased towards the British side of things. So, whilst I would definitely recommend you read Six Frigates, if you're interested in that period, I would generally, as I actually advised somebody who asked a similar question in chat recently, if you want to get a more complete and balanced understanding of of that particular era and those particular ships especially, I would advise looking for 2 or 3 books that are written by good authors from different points of view. Read both or all 3, depending on how many you choose, and take everything that they say in balance together, because there's various things that the various books either do or don't say, to leave out or include, which the others don't. So I personally, whenever anyone asks me about American frigates and the War of 1812 from the naval perspective, I always say to people, look, get The Challenge and get Six Frigates, read the two, and then form your own point of view somewhere in between the two perspectives. They're both fantastic books, and definitely recommended. Now, as far as Germany focusing on the Arctic convoys more, and whether that could knock Russia out of the war, it could certainly make life a heck of a lot more difficult for Russia. There were a number of critical supplies that came in via Allied aid. However, it has to also be remembered that although the Arctic convoys were near enough the primary route for the things that actually mattered, they weren't the only route. There were 2 or 3 other routes into Russia, which, even if the Arctic convoys had been shut down completely, would have allowed the flow of some material. And ultimately, Russia's a very big place. It would have hurt them a lot more, but ultimately, with the Germans launching Barbarossa when they did, with the forces that they did, I don't think they were ever going to actually win. Certainly not with that particular set of circumstances, and then the decisions that were made thereafter, none of which are particularly affected by whether or not the Arctic convoys are working. The other thing is that, to be perfectly honest, by the time the Arctic convoys are up and in full swing, I've mentioned in other videos about the Germans potentially concentrating all surviving Admiral Hipper Deutschland class plus Scharnhorst and Tirpitz in Norway, and posing a much bigger threat to the Allied convoys that way. It's entirely possible, it's entirely doable. However, and I do have to stress this as a big however, the simple fact by that point is that all that would really accomplish in terms of shutting down the Arctic convoys is it would force the Allies to put a lot more resources into protecting them, because the Allies have the resources to be able to protect them, because by this point America's in the war. So Washington and Alabama in particular spend a fair bit of time wandering around on Arctic convoy duty. It's very difficult to imagine how the Germans could have shut the Arctic convoys down. They could have done a lot more damage, certainly. They could have posed a much greater threat, definitely. But if they'd chosen to focus on them, then the Allies would have chosen to focus their response on it, at which point you would have seen convoys escorted by, say, a carrier and 3 battleships, or 3 battleships and battlecruiser, plus an entire cruiser squadron and a couple of destroyer flotillas, instead of the historical already fairly heavy escort. Now, fair enough, yes, that's going to drain the Allied efforts elsewhere. It's certainly going to have a long-term knock-on effect on how the war is conducted overall. But ultimately, Germany can't put a concentration of force into Norway that's bigger than what the Allies can come up with in response. So, yeah, knocking out the Arctic convoys total and shutting them down, incredibly unlikely to happen. So those questions were all taken from the Mogami video. Now questions from the anti-submarine warfare video. The Muncie Wolverine asks, is there any way for a submerged submarine to kill another submerged submarine in the World War One period, or even to detect one? So, yes, there were a couple of ways for a submerged submarine to kill another submerged submarine. The most common one was actually mines. Submarine-laid mines accounted for a fair number of submarines on both sides, although that's probably not necessarily what you were thinking about. You're probably thinking more about direct combat. In direct combat, in theory, you could try and torpedo another submarine. But obviously the 3D environment created by being underwater means it would be a very chancy thing. You'd probably be looking for something that's running at periscope depth or just below, and just firing a torpedo running at standard depths and hoping you've got all the calculations right. There's certainly no way if you're both down 100 feet, unless you've invented some clever way of jury rigging a torpedo to stay static at 100 feet. There's no way you're going to engage it, and obviously the chances of you both being at the same level are pretty slim. But that kind of all comes back to what you were talking about detecting them in the first place, because you need to detect them to work out firing solution. You could, of course, ram them. Underwater ramming is always a possibility, but in terms of detection, that was very much the difficult thing. There were early hydrophones in the period, and the reason that the R3 above is pictured is because, as I mentioned in that video, the R3 was the world's first hunter-killer submarine, with a big array of hydrophones on the front, designed specifically to detect enemy submarines by listening for the sounds of their propellers and machinery. So yes, in theory it was possible if you're using an R-class or something with a similar array of hydrophones it's possible to detect an enemy submarine underwater. The whole then getting close enough to it and actually killing it is a little bit more of an esoteric skill, with most submarine-on-submarine kills that weren't mines generally involving one or the other being surfaced. Paul Brun asks, you always hear a lot about German U-boats. I know the Austro-Hungarian Empire was mostly landlocked, but did other Central Powers attempt to use U-boats? For that matter, what about other European Axis powers in World War II? I know the Italians had Frogmen, but did they have any substantial or useful U-boats? So yes, in World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire did have a number of submarines. They built just over around about 4 dozen of their own U-boats, and they also had a bunch of German U-boats get shipped down and operate under the Austro-Hungarian flag. So they were the Austro-Hungarian U-5 is pictured here. That's pretty much it for the Central Powers for World War I. Italy, of course, rather adroitly switching sides, and that leaves the Ottomans, who had a relatively minimal submarine fleet where its most substantially powerful unit actually was a captured French submarine that they managed to fish out of the Dardanelles. In terms of the Axis powers in World War II, the Japanese had a lot of submarines. They had everything from midget subs to small and medium subs to fleet subs to submarine aircraft carriers, and they had a lot of subs. They weren't particularly well used or particularly effective, but, unless you happen to be the USS Wasp. But they definitely had a very big submarine fleet. The Italians as well actually had a fairly substantial submarine fleet themselves. However, they faced the same problem that a lot of other nations, especially the British, faced when operating in the Mediterranean, which is the Mediterranean is not really the best theatre to operate a submarine in, not by a long shot. It's generally relatively shallow compared to the oceanic depths of the Atlantic. It's fairly confined, the waters are fairly clear, which makes spotting from the air fairly easy, and being confined, there's a much greater density of shipping, which means you need to be really sharp on the crash diving aspect of things. So a lot of Italian submarines were lost. They did do a fair amount of damage. The Italians unfortunately had this slight problem of having designed their submarines to operate in the Mediterranean, even though some of their larger fleet submarines weren't particularly good at it, but nobody's fleet submarines particularly were very good at it, they found that when they sent Mediterranean-adapted submarines out into the Atlantic, everyone got very cold very quickly. The Italian submarines, although they did operate in the Atlantic as part of the Battle of the Atlantic, not the world's most successful units in general. They did have a plan, as I covered in one of the videos on midget submarines. They did have a plan of sticking a midget sub on the back of one of their fleet subs and then going off to attack New York Harbour. But yes, so all three Axis powers had relatively substantial and relatively useful submarine fleets at the beginning of World War II, but with varying degrees of success in their actual operational use. Onus Knox asks, how did they know what submarine they'd sunk when they sank it? Did someone throw on goggles and swim down there, or did the Germans own up to what they'd lost, or is the info put together post-war, or what? There's a wide variety of ways of determining what you'd sunk, actually. Now, specifically in terms of the World War I period, bearing in mind that the British had very thoroughly compromised German communications via Room 40, they sometimes knew which submarine was even in the air in the first place because they'd intercepted orders to a specific submarine, or they'd recorded a specific submarine call sign, so they could put two and two together. Sort of, well, in this patch of ocean, we know that this was the only U-boat operating. We also know that a destroyer or a cruiser has sunk a submarine in this area today. 99% chance it's therefore this submarine. In other times, the submarine would surface, or would be caught on the surface in the middle of the battle that would eventually lead to its sinking, so the crew could spot what submarine it was from the number on the sail. Alternatively, there could be survivors, and the survivors could just say, well, yes, we were on submarine, whatever. There's not particularly any harm in that once the submarine's gone down. Sometimes effects would be recovered from the submarine as the pressure hull imploded. You might get bits and pieces floating up, lifebelts, books, sadly enough, uniforms, bodies, etc., which could be identified as coming from a particular submarine. Occasionally a wreck might sink in very shallow water and you could inspect it, but that wasn't very common at all. And sometimes it would be the result of post-war, post-battle signal work. So if the Germans sent out, say, a dozen submarines and they come back from patrol and two of them are missing, and you then get the call signs as they come back into harbour, and you can then match, okay, well, two of the call signs are missing, therefore those submarines must be the ones that we sank. So yeah, there's a whole variety of methods. It's never an entirely exact science, and to be perfectly honest, there's still U-boats out there for which we know they sank because they didn't come back, but we still don't know who sunk them or where. And there are instances of submarines that were known to be sunk, i.e. this destroyer reported sinking a submarine and got definitive proof, but we still don't know which one they actually sank because no one's found the wreck and no one can quite match it up from the war records. So yeah, it's not an exact science, but there are a number of ways that could be used to determine which submarine you just sunk. Master of Dickery asks, is it true dreadnoughts could flood the torpedo blisters on one side to create a list to extend their range? If so, how often was this an occurrence, and was this shore bombardment only, or could this be done in battle? So yes, dreadnoughts could indeed flood parts of themselves in order to tilt the ship and induce an artificial list. This was actually part of torpedo defence and general flooding defence that was brought in relatively early in the dreadnought era. The idea being that if you had, let's say your ship has a buoyancy factor. Actually, let's not use a buoyancy factor. Let's use a more simple term. Let's say your ship displaces 20,000 tons. But let's say you can take on 4,000 tons of water and the ship will just about remain afloat. So if you take on that 4,000 tons of water on one side, the chances are that even though technically you could remain afloat, the ship's going to capsize and then you're going to sink because you're going to take on a lot more water very quickly. So what they very quickly figured out is that you can use pumps and bulkheads and such like to even out the flooding. So you could either let water that was flooding in one side of the ship flood to the other side of the ship, or you could artificially pump water into a ship. So if you say your ship, your theoretical 20,000 ton ship that can take up to 4,000 tons of flooding, although that's a very high amount for a ship of that kind of size. Let's say you have a breach that allows 2,000 tons of water in on one side. Well, okay, great. Theoretically, you can remain afloat, but again, you might be a bit worried about the fact that that list is going to actually capsize you, regardless of whether or not you've technically got the buoyancy to stay floating. So what you might then do is flood the other side of the ship to the tune of, say, 1,000 tons of water, and so you've now taken on 3,000 tons. You're still capable of remaining afloat, but you're now on a much more even keel and less likely to tip over. So with these systems in place, it was relatively easy to induce artificial flooding on one side of the ship when you weren't being attacked, in order to create a list which would then obviously mean that your guns could elevate higher on the opposite side, which would extend your range. This generally wasn't done with battleships a lot, although in cases like the D-Day landings they definitely did do so. The USS Texas as one example. It was mostly done in shore bombardments, as you notice, and only then when you effectively had to see superiority. Now the reason for this is, one, a list does still decrease your overall stability. So if you've listed your ship and somebody puts a torpedo in that side, you are probably in a lot of trouble. Secondly, putting a list on the ship also will slow it down. So you definitely don't really want to do this in battle, because the only reason you do it in battle would be to extend your gun range to engage an enemy who can outrange you. The problem is, if you then do that, you've slowed your ship to a point that the enemy can either close you down very quickly or could just sail even further out of range, and there's not a lot you can do about that. As well as the aforementioned fact you've just let a bunch of water into your ship voluntarily, which is probably not a good idea to do in the face of an enemy battleship that's about to possibly let a lot of water into your ship involuntarily. So yeah, it's basically for shore bombardment duty only, unless you're counter-flooding in order to balance out the list that might have developed, as mentioned earlier. And the last question from the anti-submarine warfare video. Captain Zapp asks, is it true that RMS Olympic killed a submarine by ramming? I'm sure I've read that somewhere. Well, yes, you did in fact read that properly. In 1918, 12th of May to be precise, with the 59th Regiment of United States Infantry aboard, the RMS Olympic was heading for France. There were quite a lot of US troops on board, as you might imagine, from the sister ship of the Titanic, and they spotted a surfaced U-boat ahead. Olympic, being an RMS ship, had been built with specially strengthened fittings to be able to take guns, and had been fitted during wartime service with guns, so the gunners opened fire at the submarine, which obviously decided it was going to dive. The captain of the Olympic, not particularly wanting to emulate either the Titanic or the other sister ship Britannic, which had been sunk by submarines earlier in the war, decided, you know what, stuff this, I'm going after him, and took aim with a 46,000-ton liner moving at full speed at the rather embattled U-103, and, well, you can imagine what happens when a 46,000-ton ocean liner moving at speed smashes into a small World War I era submarine. Nothing good for the submarine. As it turns out, the crash dive almost saved it, but the keel of the ship basically smashed open the top of the submarine's overall hull, just after the conning tower, and the propellers did a really nice number on the pressure tank, on the pressure hull. So U-103 was doomed, but not quite as doomed as it would have been if it had stayed on the surface, at which point it would have just been cut clean in half. The submarine was going down very quickly, but they managed to blow their ballast tanks, get to the surface, get out before the submarine went down. one of the US destroyers that was trying to keep pace with the Olympic managed to pick up a few survivors. Olympic had a few dents and bits of battering and everything, but was absolutely fine otherwise. The American infantry aboard, obviously not particularly looking forward to an Atlantic swim, were rather grateful and presented the ship with a plaque to commemorate the event. And now on to Patreon questions. I did mention David Peachy and Admiral Tiberius last week, but we had run out of time to answer their questions. So this week we will. Dave Peachy asks a question about shot dispersion in warships of the 1920s and later, i.e. utilising post-World War I designs, with multiple guns per turret. The question being, what factors, other than sea state and atmospheric weather conditions, contributed to the dispersion of shots from the guns in a single turret, and how prevalent was that? He wants to include a number of assumptions that all guns in a single turret were built to the same standards. Well, that will partly rule out some of the problems with the Nelson class. 2, the turret mechanism and all gun barrels are in good working order. Well, fairly obvious one. 3, all guns in the turret are trained to the same elevation and fired at the same time. That one we'll come back to. The shells and charges used were consistent with a specific batch of each. Well, there goes my rant about the Littorios. He says, I appreciate that this would likely be worse under battle conditions rather than in drills or practice, and there may be variables involved which obviate some assumptions, so there may not be a single or simple explanation for this. Well, as briefly covered in that summary, yes, shells and charges sometimes were inconsistent, the Littorios being especially notorious for that. Obviously, gun barrels did wear out, and on certain ships, such as the Nelson class in the 20s and early 30s, it wasn't necessarily the case that the guns in a given turret were all built to the same standard when it came to rifling, both in terms of the ratio of the rifling and even which direction the rifling went. But outside of that, there are a number of other issues that affected how shots from guns would disperse. One of which was how close you packed the guns. Now, if you pack the guns much closer together, obviously you can fit them in an overall smaller turret, which saves weight, and you may be able to use that weight to increase the turret armour or something else on the ship. Or your ship might just be narrow enough that you have to cram the guns close together. However, this is detrimental to accuracy, because when the gun fires, obviously you get the blast and shockwave of the explosion coming out of the gun barrel, and if the guns are too close together, then that disturbed air turbulence and shockwave can interfere with the shells next to it. And this was a problem on early American 8-inch gun heavy cruisers. This was a problem also on a number of the standards that they had to solve during the interwar period. It was a problem on the Richelieus with their sort of 2 twin turrets in close formation assemblage for their quad turrets. And it was an appreciated problem on things like the Town class, i.e. they knew it was going to be an issue, but they moved to address it before it became an issue. Now, there were 2 ways of dealing with this. One of which was the approach that they took actually in the Town class. So if you look at HMS Belfast, for example, which is you step back, in the case of a triple turret, you step back the central gun, which slightly removes that central shell from the blast effects of the other 2 guns, and the other 2 guns are then spaced out enough. So that's one way of doing it, but that presupposes you actually recognise the issue ahead of time. The other way of doing it for situations where you've built the turrets and they're all nice and equal, and now you're having problems, which, to say, was things like the American standards, is to introduce what's called a delay coil. So, again, using the central gun on a triple turret, or alternating guns if you're using a quad, you would press the firing stud, but the guns with the delay coils would fire just a fraction of a second later than the others, and that would allow the worst of the initial shockwave from the first firing guns to disperse or pass by the area of the second firing gun's muzzle, which then reduces the interference pattern. So that would improve accuracy. Broadly speaking, most of these issues apply to triple and quadruple turrets, because very, very, very few twin turrets ever had issues with the guns being too close together. And generally twin turrets, one of the reasons a number of navies preferred twin turrets and retained them was because they were not subject to a lot of these problems. Now, another issue can be either underbuilding the gun or overcharging it, one way or the other. Basically, you get your relative calculations wrong, and that's because guns are very long, and this is also an issue with building the longer sort of 50 and 50 plus caliber guns. And that is that although the gun is made of metal, it is still, to a degree, flexible. And although it needs a lot of force to make it bend, well, the charge on a naval shell is a lot of force. So if your gun was too lightly built, or if your charge was a bit too much, or both, then when you fired the gun barrel itself would whip. And that is like, sort of take a bit of clothesline or something and whip it up and down. That's that kind of effect you'd get, although obviously hopefully on a much smaller scale than the sine wave you can create with some washing line, would be what would happen to the guns when you fired them. Obviously, if that happens, the muzzle is moving in a way that you don't want it to when the shell exits, and also the shell may well have been subject to unwanted horizontal or vertical jostling as it goes down the barrel, and that will lead to the shell going off in all sorts of interesting directions. A similar but related issue is droop. Now, again, if you've underbuilt the gun barrels might just bend and droop down anyway under their own weight. But more generally speaking, as anyone who's watched metal being forged will be able to tell you, the warmer metal gets, the more flexible it gets. And one very easily guaranteed way of heating up a gun barrel is to fire shells through it very quickly. So in battle conditions, if you're just trying to churn shells out as fast as humanly possible, you can end up, especially if you're firing for a particularly long period of time, you can end up with the gun getting so warm that gravity and the shockwave either starts to whip or starts to droop the barrel, when perhaps when fired at the beginning of the battle it may not have actually done that. So this can affect your accuracy as well, because obviously now your gun barrel isn't actually pointing where you think it is. And this was one of the reasons why guns were so heavily built up, and also one of the reasons why, unless it was a sort of a guaranteed kill area, people didn't tend to like chucking shells out at the absolute maximum theoretical rate of fire, if they even could achieve that, as a general rule, because if you've got that calculation wrong and you burn through a bunch of ammo over, say, 4 or 5 minutes of rapid fire, you've now begun to compromise the accuracy of your guns, and you may not actually have hit anything. So you would try and reserve that kind of maximum attainable rate of fire for when you've got the range completely locked in and the hits are near enough guaranteed. And the final most common issue is basically how good is your fire control system, because as we've discussed in previous Drydock, the stabilization system for firing a gun more relied on timing rather than actually trying to fully gyro-stabilize an entire gun turret. Now, there's two factors involved with that, one of which is, are your electronics sensitive enough and fast-acting enough to fire the guns when your stabilization system detects that you've reached the optimal pitch and roll? And obviously if they get it slightly wrong, if there's a slight delay in the system, that then it's going to fire when your ship is then in a considerably more horizontal or vertical motion, which is going to throw off your aim. The other thing is ship design itself. And this is why generally it's a relatively bad idea to fit overly large guns onto smaller hulls. Stability issues aside, is simply the fact that a small hull is a lot more lively. Or if you're talking about different classes of battleships, obviously different designs can have different rates of roll, they can have different sharpnesses of roll, they can pitch and dive more vigorously or more rapidly, and they're not necessarily the same things. And obviously the more movement there is on your ship, the more that's going to affect the dispersion of the shot, because your gyro stabilizers they'll fire when the ship's at its most stable, but if your ship's not very stable to start with, you're only making the best of a bad job. So there's that as a factor as well. So those are the more common factors outside of the ones you've kind of ruled out in your question as regards shot dispersion in warships, particularly capital ships. Admiral Tiberius asks, what is your opinion/theory on what happened to the 3 Colliers Proteus, Cyclops and Nereus that disappeared in the same area of the Atlantic/Caribbean at different points during and between World War I and World War II? All 3 were sister ships of the same class, and the 4th sister was converted into the carrier Langley. And was there any other cases of multiple ships, civilian or military, of the same class disappearing mysteriously? So I'm really glad you asked this question, because I have, as you might unsurprisingly imagine as an engineer, I've come up with my own particular little theory on this, which factors in a large number of different issues, which I think explain the loss of this particular class. Now, in terms of multiple ships, civilian of military of the same class disappearing mysteriously, I'm not aware of any. I did have a look, I couldn't find any particularly. If anyone else knows of a similar class of ship, or not similar, a class of ship that has had multiple members disappear mysteriously, let me know. But I think particularly with these Colliers, there are a number of factors involved. So one is that as Colliers, so shockingly enough, they were used initially to transport coal. However, the type of coal they were used to transport was fairly acidic. Most coal is acidic to a degree, but this was particularly so. And it was known that acidic coal eats into the structural beams and such of ships, which is not good. Obviously, makes their structures weaker. These ships were then later transferred to moving various ores of various kinds, manganese ore, bauxite, which is aluminium ore, etc., etc. But there's no record of their internal structures, particularly in the holds, being renovated, refitted, replaced, etc., or even strengthened. So the kind of weaknesses that would have been put in by their periods transporting acidic coal would have remained, as well as any other caustic substances, various ores and such that they would transport thereafter. Now, there's a second factor, which is that once they're moved to this kind of ore transport, generally speaking, ore is metallic, ore is a lot heavier than coal, which would lead to one of two things. You either fill the ships up to their original load lines, as designed as Colliers, in which case you overload them, or you load them up to the designed weight, in which case you have a lot less material in. Both of these have issues. Obviously, the overweight issue is self-explanatory. It makes the ship unstable and puts far more strain on it than it's otherwise designed for. And if you load it with less volume so that the weight is correct, you have the fact that the ore is now loose in a non-full hold, which means it's much more subject to be able to move around, such as, say, in a storm. And obviously, if you've got sort of 8,000 tons of ore and you hit a big wave and the ship rolls somewhat, and you've now got empty space for that ore to move in, and it all shifts to one side, that's probably going to take your ship down fairly quickly. So, combination of weakened hull structure and internal beam structure, combined with the fact that they're transporting loads for which they're not designed, either in terms of shifting or in terms of being overloaded, plus they have the one particularly unfortunate design feature that's particularly related to this class, which is their length. Their length being about 550 feet. Now, this one did take me a fair bit longer to actually find some specific references for, but the area that they disappeared in, that is basically roughly in the area that most people know as the Bermuda Triangle, it's known for storms, as is much of the Atlantic. However, the wavelength of the storm, i.e. the distance between peak to peak or trough to trough of the waves, the wavelength of the typical kind of storm that you get out there is around about 500 to 600 feet, which is rather interesting. The wavelength varies depending on where you are. It's a whole mixture of wind conditions, sea conditions, depth of the ocean, currents, etc. So no two areas are going to have precisely the same wavelength for storms. But this particular type of wavelength is pretty critical because it means that if the ship is doing the sensible thing for most ships, which is to sail into the waves, you definitely don't want to go broadside to waves because you just get flipped over. But if it's sailing into the waves, you're going to have moments where the ship is basically with its bow and stern in a trough and its centre on a peak, which means that effectively the ship's going to be supported in the middle and not at the ends, so that's going to induce bending. And then half a wavelength later, you're going to end up in a situation where both bow and stern are supported by wave peaks, and the centre of the hull, the middle part of the ship, is effectively, although not quite, but effectively hanging in free space as far as support from the ocean goes, which is kind of like a perfect storm of bending moments on a ship. Now, when none of those three issues will necessarily kill a ship, although in extremes any one of those has been known to kill ships, but when you combine all three, so you have a ship that's got weakened hull structure, it's transporting cargo that can move, that's most likely to be able to move around, and then gets caught in a storm that is basically has a wavelength such that the flexing on the ship is the absolute worst possible. I think that's pretty much the explanation for why these ships kept going down in that area, because as the ships would have been bent, they would have already been subject to the worst possible bending moments for those ships in a storm because of the wavelength of the sea almost matching the wavelength of the ship. Oh, the length of the ship, sorry. And then when that bending motion happens, the ship's hull isn't able to resist that bending moment anywhere near as well as it should, because its internal members have been eaten away by caustic loads, so it's much more likely to break. And if it does start to bend, buckle, break, etc., those internal loads when they're transporting ore, are much more likely to shift and move around, which is just going to increase the point loading or the list on one side of the ship, which will contribute to the ship hull being under further stress, which means it's much more likely to break apart still. So overall, you'll probably end up with a perfect storm of circumstances where you'd be sailing in a storm, not able to do very much about it, the ship's creaking and groaning worryingly around you, and then all of a sudden it just comes apart and goes down very quickly. Well, because you've got several thousand tons of metal ore on board. So yes, that's my personal theory as to quite how you managed to lose 3 out of the 4 Proteus class colliers. The fact that Langley was converted from USS Jupiter early on, and as a naval ship with a much more extensive service history of refits, would have meant A, its structural members wouldn't have been eaten away nearly as much to start with. B, if there was any issues, they would have been rectified more commonly because it would have been an active service warship. And then also it's not carrying massive shifting loads and didn't operate that often in an area of the world where the wavelength of the typical storm was similar to the length of the ship. Although obviously Japanese aircraft didn't particularly care about all of those factors. So yes, that's my personal theory. Hope you could understand what I'm going on about, and that is that. And that brings us to the conclusion of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video.